It's going to be a bit of a unique spring camp for BYU football this spring, and maybe not for the reason or reasons that you're thinking. And the best way that Kalani Sitake can approach it is by simply being himself, and that is to be perfectly honest.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day, and more importantly, thank you to all of you who are everydayers with us right here on your original daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. All right, let's get started on today's show. We're going to talk a little bit about spring camp for BYU. We'll talk about a boost that's returning to BYU for spring camp. This should help out one particular position group in the defensive secondary. And then we'll finish up today's show talking a little BYU basketball and how the Cougars, who are suddenly on a 3-game win streak, have everything to play for as they head to Arizona this weekend. All right, so starting off today's show, Kalani Sitake has a very interesting spring camp ahead of him, which begins next week. Think about that. Next week, we have BYU spring ball. Now, February hardly screams spring, but nonetheless, that's when BYU will kick off their spring camp. But this month-long camp for BYU is going to be an interesting one simply due to the fact that at the end of it, BYU, along with their fellow compatriots, across college football at the FBS level, are all going to be required to cut down their rosters to 105 man. What does that mean for BYU football? Well, across college football for the past few years, at least, you've been able to carry 123 players on your roster. BYU will lose upwards of 18 and maybe potentially as many as 20 walk-ons this coming spring, and a number of them have already left the program. That's the thing about this, is the situation at hand relates back, and we've talked about this often on the podcast, that the House settlement that the NCAA is still trying to get finalized, which officially goes into effect on April 7th, has a whole litany of different things it's going to impose on college athletics. But in college football, it is going to pare down college football rosters. It is going to make a cap of 105 players on every college football roster. So BYU is not immune to this. They're not unique in all this. But the fact of the matter is Kalani Sitake pointed out to my good friends over at KSL Sports, pointed out that BYU, the story of Tyler Algier and countless other walk-ons who have gone on to have incredible careers in BYU uniforms, will be lost in some shape or manner as this House settlement progresses. Because with the 105-man roster cap that the NCAA will impose, it also will open the door to have all 105 of those rosters fully scholarshiped. Previously, 85 scholarships was the limit for FBS football. You could have up to that many, and then you could carry, I said, the 123-man roster. So that added 40 some odd, 38 some odd walk-ons to the programs. Those walk-ons for many programs, especially at programs like BYU, have been indispensable and, quite frankly, have been very critical to the success that football programs like BYU have had over the past few years. Kalani Sitake pointed directly to the Tyler Algier story. Because remember, Tyler was a walk-on, a 2-star athlete out of Fontana, California, had run for all kinds of yardage in his high school ranks, but barely got much attention at the FBS level. He bet on himself, decided BYU was where he wanted to be, came to Provo, spent time on both sides of the football early on in his career, playing both linebacker, which actually started games at linebacker for BYU, and then went on to have the single most prolific season in BYU football history for a running back. That was it, 1,500 yards he notched. It was absolutely incredible what he accomplished in a BYU uniform. And under the current guidelines, which are set to go into effect soon enough, that story may be lost to the annals of history. Could that story be reprised at the FCS or the D2 level? Maybe so, but the fact that BYU at the end of the spring camp is going to have to cut down this roster means that some fan favorites may be looking elsewhere to continue their playing careers. And that's disappointing, I'm sure, for many of you out there, because you've watched BYU football, you've cheered for BYU football, you've wanted nothing more than to watch the Cougars succeed at the highest levels in football, and they have. 11-2 this past season was a monumental accomplishment for BYU football. But guys who were key cogs in that may be lost. And you already can point to guys like an Isaiah Moa, who's transferred to Michigan State, Crew Wakely, a walk-on himself, transferring to Purdue. They've already had these conversations. And as Kalani Sitake told KSL Sports, the only way that he's going to be able to approach this is, quote, having direct feedback with the players for the transfer portal in the winter and being honest with them about where we see and about what we see and where they fit. That's why we were able to see some of the guys going to the portal and finding them places to play. Then having the same feedback with the portal that's going to open up in April, allowing those young men to have a new place. Our roster is already a lot smaller than it normally would be going into spring because we've already had to make some adjustments. And already the adjustment is just being straight up honest with people. That's, I think, the most stand-up thing I have heard from a college coach in Kalani Sitake saying, we're just being straight up with guys, saying, hey, this is where you stand on the roster. If you want to remain at BYU, here's what it's going to take. But there may be other guys simply that you say, hey, sorry to do this to you, and we appreciate everything you've, the heart, sweat, soul, blood, whatever you've put into this program. We appreciate all of it. But the simple fact of the matter is these roster adjustments necessitate we've got to cut down your roster group by 1 to 2 bodies, and we see you as one of those guys we're going to have to cut. We want to help you find your next spot. That's one thing that Kalani Sitake has been very open about during his time as BYU football head coach. If there are young men who have aspirations of playing college football and BYU is not for them for whatever reason, whether it's the coaching staff telling them that, it's themselves telling the coaching staff that, hey, this is not a fit for me, regardless of whose fault or no fault it is, BYU and Kalani Sitake have been very, very adamant in being honest with guys, but more importantly, helping guys find opportunities to continue their playing career. The sad fact of the matter is, with this roster cutdown coming across college football, take 18 guys at minimum. Now, BYU's probably already under that 123-man cap that they previously had, as he mentioned. Speaking of the winter, the BYU helped guys hit the portal and look for new programs. But times 18 times 134 programs, and we're talking about hundreds upon hundreds of guys suddenly being cut loose from college football programs and needing to find a new place to play. FCS programs, other FBS, G5 programs, D2, all the way down to the NAIA level, D3, etc., are going to benefit from the trickle-down effect of these athletes so long as they continue to hope to play their college football careers. The tough part is, as I mentioned, is that guys that you have been rooting for, you would like to see succeed at BYU, simple math may necessitate that they're not going to be at BYU any longer. And that's a tough pill to swallow, but it's one that Kalani Sitake is doing his best with. And as he mentioned, he's being straight up honest with guys. And I think that's the least you can do in this circumstance for these athletes. And I hope that BYU navigates pretty choppy waters here as best they possibly can. And with Kalani Sitake at the helm, I've got no doubt the BYU will make sure that the players that have aspirations of continuing to play college football, want to live out their football dreams, well, he'll do his best to help them live those out at BYU. But if it's not at BYU, I can guarantee that Kalani will look at all options and make phone calls on their behalf to help them live out those dreams wherever else they may end up playing. And I think it's disappointing, but at the same time, having a stand-up leader like Kalani Sitake, it means a lot, I think, to these young men to know that that guy will go to bat for them in this circumstance. All right, coming up next, BYU got some good news as one of our burning questions ahead of BYU spring camp starting. Well, it got a major boost over the weekend. We'll talk about why and what it means for BYU's cornerbacks, and we'll get to that next right here on Locked On Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at TurboTax. This message is brought to you by Intuit TurboTax. Taxes obviously are dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms that none of us seem to want to do or can hardly understand. And then you're always waiting and wondering and worrying if you're going to get any money back. Now, taxes is as easy as uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who is matched with your unique tax situation, and they handle it for you guys. An expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. And while they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress. And of course, you get the most money back guaranteed, all while you go about your day doing whatever else you have. No stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now, this is taxes. It's all courtesy of your friends over at Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Do want to clarify that only available with TurboTax live full service. Also, real-time updates are only available in the iOS mobile app, and see guarantee details at turbotax.com/guarantees. We get started once again with your expert today at turbotax.com. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Hope you're having a fantastic day whenever you hear and or watch this. I am back. Apologies for the lack of podcast earlier this week, but I had an extended little stay down in Las Vegas, not a residency. My daughter was performing in a national championship event for cheer, and really had a great time supporting her, getting away with the family for a little bit. But thank you for all your well wishes. I think I put out on social media I was going to be out of commission for a little bit, but it's good to be back in the saddle. All right, so BYU football kicks off spring camp next week. It's crazy to think it's coming that quickly, but hey, here it is. And BYU's cornerbacks unit, led by Gennaro Guilford, was one that lost quite a bit of talent from last year. Remember, Jacob Robinson exits the program, Mark Collins exits the program. And there was a thought at the end of the season that Maury Bamba's time in a BYU uniform was at an end. Remember, he was a late transfer to BYU from Tyler Junior College. Former BYU player Tanner Jacobson's doing a bang-up job with the Tyler Junior College program. He noticed that Maury Bamba was a great athlete, recommended him to BYU, and Maury came in as a pretty raw athlete and really kind of worked and developed as he went along, and emerged on the other side as a very capable cornerback with length, athleticism, and most importantly, speed. But the hope was that BYU would get him set up to where he could continue his playing career at the professional level. Well, then that Diego Pavia situation came about, allowing junior college players like Maury Bamba to challenge for another year of eligibility. Well, Maury did just that and got the official news over the weekend that BYU will get him back for another year, and he said he's very happy to be back as a BYU Cougar. You can pencil him in as close to putting it in pen as a starter for BYU this season. What he did the tail end of last year, particularly in that Alamo Bowl, showed everything that he has worked for during his BYU career. He has been a guy who has been really honing his craft, and it really felt like he was coming into his own finally, and now the payoff could he go out there and become an all Big 12 type player during his final season of eligibility for BYU? Well, BYU hopes so, because with the other guys on BYU's cornerback depth chart, BYU needs a veteran leader like Maury Bamba to step up. Now, there are other guys in that cornerback room. I look most notably at Evan Johnson and say, okay, that's a guy who's also expected to step up for BYU this year as a part-time starter this past year, really kind of rotating time with Maury Bamba. Those who can hold down the fort, BYU could be in very good shape, but that doesn't mean that the young talent for BYU won't also be chomping at the bit to show what it's capable of. Guys like Marcus McKenzie. Marcus has been a special teams ace, been waiting and biding his time, hoping to get a chance at cornerback. Could this finally be his breakout? Could the two young freshmen that BYU featured a lot this year in Trey Alexander and Jonathan Cabea, could they finally step into their own and make one of those positions their own? The nice part is the versatility that Jay Hill has in his defense allows for a myriad of different players to play at any given time. And Gennaro Guilford has also shown, as BYU cornerbacks coach, that if he has guys, I'm talking plural, if he has multiple guys he feels like can play, he is not afraid to rotate them. He's not a guy who's going to be like, hey, you know what? You're my guy, and you're going to be my guy, and you're going to remain my guy until otherwise. He will always play as many guys as he feels like will give BYU the best opportunity to win. So right now, BYU will go into spring camp with two veterans in the case of Maury Bamba and Evan Johnson, who will be the two lead dogs to the two vets that are going to be expected to impart their own wisdom onto the young players, but also at the same time, they'll be fending off all comers, hoping to hold on to their spots on the depth chart. But the young players, that they're going to be coming for those spots, because I know that guys like Trey Alexander didn't come to BYU to be a part-time starter. They want to be the man at BYU, and that is the opportunity that is going to be staring them in the face here. So I look at this as a win-win for BYU at cornerback, because coming into spring camp, outside of Evan Johnson without Maury Bamba, major question marks about the depth and overall talent base of who would step up and really make that spot their own. Now you have a baseline with Mori Bamba of what you have, a proven commodity that you can build upon. And a guy like Gennaro Guilford, he is one of the best developers of talent. And there's a reason why he was recently elevated to passing game coordinator on the defense, because he knows what he's talking about. He has walked the walk. He has played at BYU. He's been a standout player at BYU. He's coached so many guys and developed them into bona fide professional prospects that quite literally anybody be crazy to pass up an opportunity to work with Coach G at this point during his career. He at some point is going to get a chance to be a full-time defensive coordinator. Heck, he may end up as a head coach someday. But Gennaro Guilford, so long as he's at BYU, you can essentially say that BYU's cornerbacks have never been in a better spot than they are right now with Gennaro Guilford coaching them up. I know we talked last week about the disappointment of Jacob Robinson not making the NFL Combine, and that is a major miss, it feels like to me, with regards to just not understanding what that guy meant to BYU, his capabilities as a player, etc. But the nice part is you look forward here for BYU at the cornerback spot. The future's extremely bright. You look at all the talent that Gennaro Guilford has assembled, and there's going to be plenty more coming for BYU in terms of the talent into this room. But you look at it right now, I think you can put together a depth chart of Mori Bamba is probably starter one at one spot. You probably put Evan Johnson, the starter, at other. And then essentially, I would say that Jonathan Cabella steps in as potentially that slot corner starter. And then you kind of fill it in from there. Trey Alexander is a backup, probably behind Evan Johnson. Jaden Dunlap or Marcus McKenzie figure in at either corner or slot corner. I'd probably put Jaden Dunlap more in the slot corner role. But the best news is that there is talent at the corner spot. And so long as Gennaro Guilford's coaching him up, I just quite literally don't fear for BYU having an issue with regards to their cornerback unit. So it's a really, really nice thing for BYU to have that type of baseline at cornerback. Because remember, it's not that long ago that BYU didn't have that depth at corner. And there was always the question annually of, okay, who is going to be BYU's next cornerback that can really step up? And that's the fun part, is you don't have to worry about that right now. You really can look at it and say, hey, we have got the right bodies at the right spot. And BYU should be feeling very, very good about the future of this cornerback position. Could injuries thin that out very quickly? Yeah, absolutely. We always knock on wood and say, hey, we're not going to worry about that. A guy like Jordan Chris, who's coming in as a freshman this year, well, he figures he's probably going to be a guy coming in the summer if everything goes according to plan. He's going to have ground to make up. But with his height and weight combo, similar to Trey Alexander, why couldn't he end up as an option for BYU down the line? That's the fun part about this. And I just continue to kind of look at the future for BYU at cornerback and who Gennaro Guilford kind of goes about recruiting. He's very quiet about it. He's not always a guy who's going to have guys tweeting out, hey, I'm offered this guy and I've got an offer from BYU here. You see it every so often. But the way that Gennaro goes about things, he's very thorough in his evaluations. And when he finally offers guys, you can tell he's done his homework. He's done hours worth of research on these guys, and he believes that they are going to give everything they've got to BYU, and more importantly, he's going to give everything he's got to them to help them become the best they can be. And obviously the extenuating circumstance beyond that is that BYU football benefits from that high-level play as they come into their own. So I think that question of BYU's depth at cornerback got a major, major boost with the return of Mori Bamba. But the nice part is spring camp should give us a full view of what to expect from that unit as a whole. And right now it feels much better than it did maybe just a week ago when it was still up in the air as to Mori Bamba's status going forward for BYU football. All right, coming up next, we're going to talk a little bit about BYU basketball. Huge win, historic win, dominant win against Kansas. Now the Cougars, can they follow it up as they head to Arizona? Big opportunity as BYU heads south to the Arizona schools, with Arizona on Saturday, then Arizona State the following Tuesday. But a major opportunity stares them in the face, and we'll talk about why coming up next right here on Locked On Cougars. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Hope you all are doing well out there. All right, quick reminder for you guys to join the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. Get a great inside scoop on all things BYU sports that I'm hearing, but more importantly, support the podcast as well. Just $5 a month to be a part of the group. And the best part is the updates come to you in the form of a text message. You can fire back with thoughts of your own via text, and we have one-on-one conversations. It's a great way to be a part of the community. And the best part is you get a 14-day free trial to see if it's the right option for you right out the gate before you're charged anything. So join us today. The hyperlink in the show notes below to join us on the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. All right. BYU basketball got a monster win over Kansas. As dominant a win as I can remember in recent memory for BYU basketball. They absolutely thrashed Kansas, but there's no rest for the weary. And BYU's right back to the grindstone, working and trying to get better as a basketball program. But they have a huge opportunity staring them in the face as they head to Arizona. Now, the Arizona Wildcats are going to prove to be a formidable test for BYU because the Cougars already lost Arizona at home. Remember, they lost and then they lost Arizona and they lost to Cincinnati. And it felt like this team was on shaky ground at that point. Well, how did they respond? Well, all they've done is won 3 straight games, beating West Virginia in West Virginia, taking down Kansas State, and as I mentioned, just absolutely demolishing the Kansas Jayhawks. BYU is sitting on a really strong position right now, and they should be feeling very strong because right now, as of recording on this podcast, BYU is 5th in the Big 12 all alone. There are 3 teams behind them. Kansas, who they just beat, is at 8-7. Baylor 8-7, and TCU, who continues to fight, scratch, and claw, they're at 8-7. There are 2 teams at 7 and 8, a couple spots back in Utah and Kansas State, and West Virginia is sitting at 6 and 8 as well. So they're all kind of bunched up there. But BYU knows right now they've got the inside track at the 5th seed when it comes to the Big 12 tournament. That's a great spot to be because that gets you that bye that everybody wants, and it gets you the essentially the lowest seed of the preceding round facing you in Kansas City. That win against Kansas, yes, it was a statement to the rest of the Big 12. The BYU is coming into their own. There's no doubt about that. That was a major win for BYU to have that on their resume, and it will prove to be one that'll help BYU in coming days and weeks. But the nice part is now they've got the inside track at that 5th spot, and they can essentially seal it up if they were able to take down both Arizona schools this week. Now, pulling off another top 25 upset in the same week as you beat Kansas, that might be a bridge too far, especially going to the McKell Center down there in Tucson, which is really tough to win in. But can we put anything past BYU right now in basketball? They've got everything to play for. They've got everything in front of them. If they were to sweep this Arizona road trip, we're not talking anymore about BYU being on the bubble. And I think that's probably already passed with that Kansas win. I'm sure the latest bracketology may be out by the time you see this. And I'm expecting BYU to be very much off the bubble at this point. But if you were to beat the Arizona schools, then we're talking about how high of a seed could BYU achieve? Could they surpass last year when they were a 6th seed? That's the type of conversation that could come out of this weekend at Arizona. Now, could the flip side happen? Could they fall flat on their face, be feeling good about themselves, reading all their press clippings and fall flat on their face? Yeah, that also could happen. You could go get beat at Arizona, and then Arizona State, who is absolutely reeling right now, could get you as well as you head into Tempe. BYU, Kevin Young, they have to make sure that the guys, that they are on the same page. And it sure feels like they are right now because there's contributions coming from across the roster. Trey Stewart's been absolutely masterful since kind of re-entering the lineup and essentially playing the most minutes he's played since his freshman campaign. It feels like Trey Stewart is having a career renaissance of sorts. And I'm not saying that he's going to become this starter for BYU. It's not his role right now for BYU, but him being an impact sub, that's a great thing. An impact guy off the bench. Mihailo Bošković, same thing. Those two were instrumental in BYU kind of resurrecting themselves against West Virginia. And since then, they've really proven to be key cogs. The depth and breadth of BYU's rotation right now, it is giving Kevin Young every option under the sun to counter every team the way that he feels like BYU best needs to play them. They need to play a 5-out lineup. They can do that with Bošković. If they need to play a 2-man big lineup, they have proven that they can run that at times as well. Doesn't matter what BYU has to do to counter these opponents, they've got options for them, and that's a big benefit to Kevin Young as he tries to find the right combination of guys. Is it going to be perfect every game? No, and it's never going to be perfect. That's pie in the sky type stuff. But the way that BYU went about just thoroughly running over Kansas. Essentially, the Jayhawks waved the white flag with 10 minutes to go. It felt like, I would say at the end of the first half, you could tell their body language was like, hey, we're done here. That was the crazy thing about that, is that halftime of that game against Kansas. I remember watching Kansas walk off the court, and I was like, you know what? This was like one of those games. It may already be over. And I said it may already, because you obviously have to wait until you see what happens in the second half. If they come out, the locker room hellfire and damnation speech that would have been rained upon them by Bill Self. Let's see how they respond to it. Well, they came out and BYU just laid more on them, and they rolled over and died. And that was a mark of a good program-wide win for BYU. I'm talking Kevin Young. I'm talking his assistant coaches, Will Voigt on down. They all did their part to help BYU be ready to exploit the mismatches they had in the lineup. And then also at the same time, BYU's players, they deserve credit for playing their absolute rear ends off. They went out there and really took it to Kansas. They made Kansas quit. Nobody can say that Kansas wasn't feeling it. This is Big 12 play. Kansas has every expectation laid upon them. National championships, Final Four runs, everything that Bill Self has come to embody at Kansas, that is heaped upon the shoulders of the Kansas Jayhawks. And the pressure, it feels like it's beginning to get to them. They're cracking under it. BYU, conversely, they had very little pressure on them, and all they've done is go out there and thrive in this circumstance. If they can go to Arizona and win those games, man, how high could BYU go when it comes to bracketology and obviously March Madness? It feels like the sky is the limit for BYU, and that's an exciting proposition, because it feels like just a week and a half ago, things were teetering on the edge of things falling apart for BYU, much like Kansas appears to be falling apart. The nice part is they rallied, they pulled together. They didn't fracture, they didn't break up. They really coalesced around one another, and that's a credit to Kevin Young for keeping guys on the same page, but it's also a credit to BYU players for buying in, understanding, hey, this is all we've got. We are who we have right here. Let's go out and make the best of our circumstance, and BYU's benefited from it. And this Arizona road trip, it could be pivotal to BYU's chances of really making noise in March Madness. I have said that the goal for me all season long for BYU was to get into the big dance and see what happens beyond that. Well, it all kind of depends on seeding in terms of the beyond that part of it. If they can get a high enough seed, a favorable matchup, yeah, then maybe make the round of 32 or make a Sweet 16, but that's still days and weeks ahead of us. The focus now has got to be on Arizona and the McKell Center Saturday night, and we'll see how they do in that circumstance. All right, so there you go. That's what I got for you guys on this Wednesday edition of the show. Feels like it's for a Monday for me, because it's technically that, but nonetheless, thank you as always for your guys' support of the podcast. Hope you guys are all doing well out there. And once again, as always, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen today. And more importantly, thank you to all of you who are everydayers with us right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.